We're going to get a little, so please tell us whether that's okay. And so, yeah, it's very short notice, but I've taken an interest in, too many things at once here. I've taken an interest in how Swedenborg's ideas, the ideas that Swedenborg revealed from the spiritual world, have made an enormous difference in all sorts of social change movements. And this is particularly relevant in politics as well. So I'm always interested when someone of our own country here in Australia has taken an interest in Swedenborg to such an extent that it actually informs their politics, and I'm hoping to hear more about that today. So I'm going to hand over to you, Dell, without wasting too much time. And if I assume that you'll be presenting, and then you'll be happy to take questions afterwards.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Discussion for anybody who wants to participate.
Yeah.
Okay. So I hand it over to you. Thank you very much, and enjoy it now. Do you not want me to launch your slideshow?
Yes, if you can. And before, so just to make sure, can everyone hear me well on Zoom? Is anyone okay? So if anyone cannot hear me, we can try to work that out. But so Mimi says she can hear. Okay. So I'm going to assume if you can't hear anybody else's, it's not coming through clearly, just let us know, and we'll try to go from there. So as I've said many times at this point, you know, my warmest thanks to the Swedenborg Society here, because the Swedenborg Association, because it was very kind of you guys to work so well to put this together on short notice, and this really was a failure on my part to realize. But I especially wanted to do this because we are talking about Alfred Deakin, who in my opinion was the greatest Australian Prime Minister. And you know, there's some other contingents, but I think really federation was Deakin's project. And the modern Australian state that we have today was really informed by him. So I ramble, and for this reason, I generally write down my presentations, and that's why I do it this way. And yeah, with that,
so I'm going to put this over here so that people online can actually see your face.
Okay, yes.
Because there's people online as well as in the stream. So.
Yes, and I.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay. I said that once. Let's begin. So the title of today's presentation is Australia and the New Jerusalem, Spiritual Vision and Swedenborgian Politics. My name is Dell Rose. I'm Associate Director of the Swedenborg Library in Chicago, and I'm Swedenborg Doctoral Fellow at the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, the Center in Amsterdam. So this is a small portion of my work, but it's an increasing initiative that many of us are taking in the scholarly field to talk about colonial esotericism and the response that that esoteric thinkers like Swedenborg. Swedenborg is my is the main topic of my research for many years. But it's to talk about how Swedenborg influenced colonial societies, and I think in some ways it's much more dramatic in the colonial world than it was in England. Although my dissertation says that it shows very clearly the importance that Swedenborg had in the 19th century. But so now we start. Oh, by the way, this was my first ever AI-generated image. I said I would like a picture of Alfred Deakin standing in front of an image of Australia, and I wanted to do the New Jerusalem coming down, but apparently Google did not realize what I meant, so this is as good as it gets.
It's pretty good though.
Yeah, for free,
Yeah.
for free last night or the night whenever I did this.
So you slept in time still.
Yeah.
Tasmanians would like it.
No. Oh, sorry, Tasmania. I wish you were there too. By the way, lots of Swedenborgians in Tasmania.
Yes.
I'm not. I'll stop the deal. So Australia has always been a state fermented and supported by radicalism. During the late 19th and early 20th century, Australia was, as New Church scholar Daniel Goodenough, a less than stellar name, Goodenough, it's not Daniel Great, but Daniel Goodenough, but nonetheless, Daniel Goodenough has called the social laboratory of the world, a place for cutting-edge ideas had a more open reception, and concepts like progress and reform were more fundamentally institutionalized than in other places around the world. In the lecture today, we will, as the title suggests, examine this radical legacy by considering the thought of Australia's greatest Prime Minister, Alfred Deakin. Alfred Deakin and his engagement with the thought of Swedish scientist, parliamentarian, and prophet Emanuel Swedenborg. Deakin was the southernmost articulator of a long-standing political tradition, which I have called political Swedenborgianism. Far from being an incidental ideology, political Swedenborgianism was central to Deakin's greatest project, that of Australian Federation. And I am not alone in believing that, were it not for Deakin, the Federation movement would not have been a success. I am, of course, not the first person to have pointed out Deakin's engagement with Swedenborg's teachings, and I am especially grateful for the work of Al Gabay, whose book The Mystic Life of Alfred Deakin was very influential on my current project. I am also happy to give those of you here today and those of you online the inside scoop, as it were, to let you know that I am currently preparing an annotated version of Deakin's Gospel According to Swedenborg, in which he laid out his vision of an ideal society. So be on the lookout, should you be so inclined. However, before diving straight into Deakin, it might be a good idea for me to define political Swedenborgianisms. You could say that actually, Swedenborgianism. Statements about heaven are always political statements. Though it might not be apparent to the visionary, to see the structure of heaven and the ultimate order of things will always have implications for the everyday. Likewise, the first generation to receive Swedenborg's revelations were also quick to point out their application for society. As Swedenborg's teachings continue to gain prominence in intellectual circles around the world, and I really do mean around the world, all 6 continents have this sort of response. South America, North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. It really was a worldwide phenomenon, and we can talk about that in many ways. So I really mean around the world, there emerged an engaged reading of Swedenborg's text that was different in character to the much more well-known ecclesiastical response, as this beautiful church next door shows us, which had reforming society at large in accordance with Swedenborg's with what Swedenborg had seen in heaven as its primary goal. As a tradition, acknowledging that there was no standard monolithic response, to say as a tradition that, I'm not saying that there was one, there are many different ways, but this is a general schema that could sort of help you understand what political Swedenborgianism means, at least as I use the term. That being said, political Swedenborgianism could be defined by these characteristics. Firstly, it was non-ecclesiastical, meaning that members were not affiliated with any particular church. 2, it was eclectic. It used a lot of different sources from a lot of other places. 3, it was strongly reformist. 4thly, it embraced and expanded on Swedenborg's concept of use and correspondence specifically, although as you see, different articulators of the tradition would add, but often these 2 are the most prominent. And finally, political Swedenborgianism emphasized Swedenborg as both spiritual teacher and man of the world. That latter part was really, really important. And I say spiritual teacher because although many accepted Swedenborg as a prophet, spiritual teacher is probably closer in line to how they understood him and his message. As to the first point, that of the non-ecclesiastical nature, though several proponents of political Swedenborgianism were members of the new church, including Augustus Nordenskiöld and Carl Bernhard Wåhlström, many were not. And I think that's a really good point to talk about. I would actually say that in terms of effect, political Swedenborgianism actually is much larger in its scope and its influence than ecclesiastical Swedenborgianism. As a tradition, it tended to see Swedenborg much more in line with his reception in the Catholic world, as predominantly a proto-medium or spiritual savant, and not necessarily as part of a new revelation. This is particularly the case, as historian Robert Danton points out, in France, where the Swedenborgian movement was largely associated with other broadly spiritual or esoteric movements, notably mesmerism. Deakin is very much in alignment with this reading of Swedenborg, and at certain points goes directly against Swedenborg's theology, particularly in the description of the Trinity. Deakin originally encountered Swedenborg's writings in Melbourne's alternative spiritual milieu, which at the time was made up largely of theosophists and various spiritualist groups, including followers of Allan Kardec. And I put this in because Allan Kardec was often the person that Swedenborg was most commonly grouped into. He likewise was a spiritualist and taught a very politically engaged form of spiritualism. So they were often read hand in hand. And where Deakin first encountered it, this was the reading that was predominant in the world. The Swedenborgian church was there, but it was very small, and it was not really available to Deakin. So really his reading of Swedenborg comes from this sort of alternative group. For Deakin, Swedenborg's vision came from the same world that was glimpsed by the spiritualist mediums at seance, though the latter was unarguably inferior to the former. Deakin believed that the truth could be ascertained in both, meaning both spiritualism and Swedenborgianism. Deakin was preoccupied with finding a religious system which united and balanced religious views from across the globe. And in addition to his devotion to Swedenborg and spiritualism, he was also very interested in the teachings of the Theosophical Society, which he joined for a trial year in 1894, following the suggestions of Annie Besant, who led the society after the death of its co-founder, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The Theosophical Society is also very interesting, by the way, because the first Theosophical Society, founded in 1775, was a Swedenborgian society. They took the name. So, but she took over after Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, seen here with her co-founder, Henry Steele Alcott. And this was also very important in Australian history. However, a year to the day, 1894, he left formally the Theosophical Society and joined Charles Strong's Australian Church, which combined theological liberalism with a strong commitment to social justice and opposition to conscription, as well as vivisection, and he was also an anti-vaccinationist. Deakin appreciated what he felt was the intellectual openness of theosophy and its transcultural claims, but he also continuously relied on Swedenborg to justify and understand any of those other claims. So Swedenborg really was central. Given this background, the ones that I've just told you about the openness, it is perhaps unsurprising to find out that Deakin was originally informed about the divine ordination of his political life at a seance in the year 1877, and he continued to receive messages about his political future at seances between 1877 and 78. He would receive a series of messages which would solidify his belief in his own prophetic mandate, and he would continue to fall back on these messages as confirmation of the path that he had chosen throughout his life. There are even a few instances where he would take advice from the seance directly to Parliament House, which caused some concern amongst his political allies. Note here, political allies, not really political opponents. There's a reason for that later. Oh, sorry, and I keep forgetting that there's people online. There's a reason for that later. But this is a quote. And the only reason I was allowed to use this is because I swore that I would not give the name of the ally who said it, but Senevi. So Alfred can be taken with flights of fancy, sometimes clipping angels' wings, but more often sounding like the rambling of those silly women seers. What are we to do? What we are to do eludes us. And then he put for some reason a question mark. I revealed it was a he, but Senevi. All right. It might surprise some to know that Deakin's religious convictions were of concern to his political allies, but they were seldomly used by his opposition. And this, I reveals the intellectual openness of Australian society during the period. This is also clearly at odds with a common image of the Australian, who is often ridiculed in the higher echelons of English culture as a sort of barbaric stereotype, and this continued well into the 20th century. And my favourite one, Sir Les, is a good example of this. I was hoping there were a lot of Australians here to appreciate Sir Les, but here he is.
You could just show us Mick Dundee would do the same.
Yeah. Similar thing. So, and Deakin would often rely on this when he was giving his public speeches, because he understood that people thought that he was sort of a bumpkin, and so when he goes to London to plead the cause of federation, they're taken by his remarkable articulation and his learnedness. And he was very much, he wanted to show these sort of snobbish, higher, aristocrats, we have a culture too, and we have a value as well. So he's very much keenly aware of what you thought an Australian was, and how he was going to play with that. And he was offered a knighthood, actually, which he refused. And there's another reason for me saying this, because although, as I've said, one of the main contentions is that in Australia there is a greater deal of openness to some of this political radicalism that ever would have taken place in Europe at the time. And that was a real indication behind why his political opponents didn't directly talk about his religious ideas, because these ideas were shared by many people. And there wasn't this sort of cultural orthodoxy that said what you could and couldn't say. That's very unique to the Australian situation and to the colonial situation more broadly. However, and there were also higher populations that were spiritualists, for instance, in Australia than in England. However,
what time frame is this we're talking about?
Late 1870s. So, however, the Deakin was also a man inspired by several spiritual traditions, not uncommonly, as I have said, amongst followers of political Swedenborgianism. It is my contention that Swedenborg's ideas were the most prominent, particularly related to his articulations of Australian federation. Indeed, as far as Deakin was concerned, and as the subtext of the lecture today, heaven's order is the basis of all worldly order and its highest completion. And he had a profound hope for what the Australian political order might become, a hope that at time approaches the millenarian. An idea taken directly from Swedenborg's writings, and this was an idea taken directly from several of Swedenborg's writings. And there are many other reasons for seeing Swedenborg as the most important in Deakin's intellectual cosmos, and particularly in these Federation documents, but I find the following to be the most salient. So one is the timeline of Deakin's engagement with Federation and what we know he was reading and writing about Swedenborg. Secondly, Deakin uses a language that's strongly inflected by Swedenborg's own use of language. And third, his willingness to embrace the spiritual or millenarian context surrounding Australian federation. As with everything else, there are other ways that I feel we could have argued for Swedenborg's influence, but I think these sort of encapsulate what I'm trying to say at this particular moment. And these are also, I think, the most compelling. And I hope that they're also compelling to all of you here. So Deakin wrote his Gospel according to Swedenborg, a 600-page treatise on Swedenborg's moral vision and political vision between parliamentary sittings between 1889 and 1890, and directly before the start of his major push for federation, with the beginning with the Australasian Federation Conference in Melbourne in February 1890. 1889, actually, the first meetings, 1890, the first formal meeting to discuss federation. Deakin spoke twice during the conference and wrote a portion of this book during his evening breaks. Furthermore, in his prayer books, we find several prayers for illumination or clarification directly citing 19th century translation of Swedenborg's books, thus confirming that during this time, at the very least, Swedenborg was essential reading and was essential in his understanding his spiritual purpose. Though we do not wish to make too much of a time period, and I can hear in the backs of some skeptical friends uttering the blasphemy of coincidence, I would like to point out repeatedly that Deakin referred to this as the first push, as the birth of federation, referring to this time, and at least in one letter we find a remarkable statement. I remember that year, talking about 1890, with great fondness. It was a 1757 form. The recipient of the letter would have understood this reference immediately, referring to Swedenborg's vision of the Last Judgment and the beginning of this new spiritual age in 1757. So perhaps it does go a little bit beyond what we might call simple coincidence, that the period had for Deakin such strong Swedenborgian associations. As to my second point, there is a strong Swedenborgian idiom, meaning way of speaking, or the way that he is articulating a lot of his ideas at work in Deakin's discussions of and advocacy of federation. In particular, we find his frequent reliance on the concept of use, which I'll talk about in a few seconds. However, as Gabay quoted, we find in one of Deakin's prayers a worldview thoroughly colored by the Swedish visionary, and this comes from prayer, from his 62nd prayer. And he asked for, that's a quote from Gabay, talking about Deakin, he asked for grace and light that I may be able to discharge with fidelity and power the task of seeking for the evidences of thy being and thy nature, which I am about to undertake. enable me in pursuing them to grow in comprehension and certitude, in setting them forth, to be a means of impressing them upon others. Grant me the intermediate guidance and inspiration of the great mind, whose utterances I am about to study, that I may, all else apart and beside, become a vehicle for the diffusion of goodness and truth. The same day we find in a letter to a childhood friend his insistence that the best way to make known the existence of God is through examining the usefulness of all things. Some may pray to be wise, Deakin says, but I will always ask first to be useful. Swedenborg sacralized the concept of utility to go beyond just effect, but rather as the most primal form of this intimate link between the manifestations of God and its presence and activity in the world. It is furthermore the essential characteristic of human form itself. And I quote, all that is, omne est, is I think how Swedenborg says it. I think Dussel says it a little bit differently. He says all that is, or something like this. So all that is, both great and small, was created from use, in use, and for use. A part in which this last, referring to the human body, its being for use ceases, so any part of the body that ceases to be useful, it is separated as harmful. This comes from Arcana Celestia, Secrets of Heaven, or Apocalypse Revealed, sorry, 1194.
Explain.
Yeah, what is it?
Explain, not revealed.
Oh, Apocalypse Explained. Thank you, thank you. Boy, you're getting snappy
You've got
here.
it written up there.
Oh, did I put? Yeah, Apocalypse Explained. See, this is fine.
George has it 80
This is
memorized.
fine.
Joda caught that anyway.
To be useful in Swedenborg's understanding was also a way to correct fundamentally one of the failures of Protestant Christendom, that of the doctrine of sola fide, or by faith alone. This doctrine holds that belief is the only thing which determines one's eternal destiny, and this was anathema to Swedenborg's experiences in the next world. Unlike prior Catholics' understandings of faith, which connected true faith with good works and participation in the sacraments, this new Protestant conception was personal and intellectual, and seemed, at least to Swedenborg, to require no act outside of intellectual agreement for salvation. This can, of course, be argued whether or not this was an accurate depiction of the Lutheran doctrine, and I should say Swedenborg was the son of a Lutheran bishop. But if it is an overt simplification, it was Swedenborg's own deduction and something that he continued to rely on throughout his life. And this is also in the fact that he was acutely aware of the subtleties of what he was saying. He wasn't someone who had no understanding of Lutheran doctrine. He was, in fact, keenly engaged with it. So Lutheran doctrine being exposed to them most literally in the crib, Swedenborg felt that the core of all that was argued was simply an attempt to divorce the spiritual life from actual practice, and this was something that he continuously pushed against. According to Swedenborg, this idea, by faith alone, was damnable, since it did not require people to have a personal, behind a form of active faith in the world. So he actually thought that was leading people into damnation. The Reformation, Swedenborg believed, which had such great spiritual promise, had been reduced to a stream of mental abstraction and slogans calcified and divorced from true Christian religion. And this was, of course, as many of you know, the title of one of his most important works. Swedenborg's doctrine of use directly played into Deakin's response on the issue of Catholic participation in the Federation. Many of the fathers of Federation movement firmly rejected anything like full Catholic participation in government. Echoing many of the concerns voiced by their English counterpoints, the predominant issue was whether or not Catholics could seriously be devoted to the nation given their simultaneous devotion to the Pope in Rome. Seems sort of strange to us today, but that was a real concern in the 19th century. And you know, there were even people who said that because Catholics would quote unquote believe anything, there was, you know, they were not advanced enough to participate in democratic governments. So they were actually intellectually disabled, is what some people have said. Though this silliness may seem a rather bizarre concern today, during the time it had a great deal of prescience. Deakin's response was to show how many Catholic societies were incredibly successful due to the practical nature of the Catholic faith and its emphasis on action and mutual accountability. Finally, for Deakin, the state must be like a body. We're beginning to hear this. Like a body, like a homo maximus, maybe. Very important in Swedenborg. So, must be like a body where every part functions for the good of the whole. This, of course, shadows Swedenborg's concept of heaven, that it is in the form of a man, and that each of the communities of angels have their perfect jobs in the kingdom of the Lord. And I quote, "True, a person is made up of countless different components, both overall and in his parts." Okay, yes. And in his parts. Overall, he is made up of members, organs, and viscera. Secondly, of chains of fibers, nerves, and blood vessels, of members within members, and then of parts within parts. Still, when a person acts, he acts as a unit. Heaven is like this, under the Lord's authority and guidance. Heaven and Hell, number 63. Numerous references to this kind of naturalistic expressions are found in Deakin's writings. Deakin, at many times, encouraged the formulators of the Federation movement to work with the understanding that the state must function for for the widest array of individuals. And he actually talks about this, we all have this part to play in the body, that's in the future Australia, that also has a artistic reception. It comes directly in the way that artistically Australia is depicted after this period in the 1890s. This was not, however, and I feel like I should say, we have to address this. This was not always inclusive of non-Europeans and the Aboriginal population of Australia. But Deakin was himself violently opposed to prejudice, actually quoting Swedenborg's opinions on the Africans at several points, and saying things like, God is made of one people, God is made of one blood, all the people of the earth. He felt that a diverse society would be more unstable than one based on a shared common history and language. He wrote in 1901, "It is not the bad qualities, but the good qualities of these alien races that make them so dangerous to us." Thus, at many points when he expressed concerns about non-European migration, it was because he was also concerned with the creation of a permanent underclass. His experiences in India and his extensive readings about race relations in the American South after the Civil War, which he had actually lived to hear about. It's in the 1860s, he's writing then. And he was very concerned about this. Deakin was also concerned about the position of Aboriginal Australians in the new federation, wanting protections to be extended to the native cultures and communities, all the while believing that the Aboriginal populations would eventually be wiped out. And if you remember, during his time, around half of them had died, succumbing to European diseases. And there was this real belief that they would either be wiped out or subsumed into the culture. I'm not trying to justify any of what he says, but I'm just saying that it was not a pure racism that motivated him. In fact, he had other concerns, and we find he was he was a very strong supporter of indigenous societies and Indians. He was not a racist person, but he sort of recognized that there would be social issues that he thought would be insurmountable if Australia became a multicultural society. That was his concern. Though we know now this was not the case. Obviously, Australia is a multicultural society and is able to function well. But it is understandably a position of time, given nearly, that was talking about half the thing. But I want to also say that it would be, it's very factually correct to say that he was a supporter of preserving individual Aboriginal rights in terms of what they could do with their own land, and he was very in support of preserving their cultures as best as he could. But he also acknowledged that this would continue to be a small part, and there probably wouldn't be in another 100 years. Again, maybe a bad thought on his hand, because that didn't turn out to be. So finally, I want to draw attention to the wide array of spiritual responses to the question of federation, and the way that Deakin himself was able to use these sort of spiritual ideas about what Australia could be to undergird the Federation project itself. Alfred Deakin highlighted the central spiritual role that Federation had for Deakin. Quoting Deakin, he says, quoting Deakin, "A federated Australia had the potential to elevate the souls of all who live within her borders, and it is the spiritual destiny." I didn't put it in for some reason. "And it is the spiritual destiny of our race, and the reason for the empire's remarkable success." However, this was far from the only religious perspective being presented. In fact, Deakin would use these, as I've said, to re-sacralize the Australian Federation experiment. And he thought to mythologize this entire experience of understanding what Australia could be. Although Swedenborgianism is, and some of this actually revolves around the millenarian aspect, that there's going to be a change, a literal change in the world at large. Although Swedenborgianism is often thought to be an amillennial tradition, meaning one that does not recognize an apocalyptic end to history or the establishment of an earthly messianic kingdom, it should be noted that many of the proponents of political Swedenborgianism understood Swedenborg's message to be fully compatible with a literal understanding of the millennium, and it was very influential in the days of the movement. One of the most prominent of these sort of early ideas of millenarianism and Swedenborgianism was the English prophet Poor Help, Samuel Best, and he created symbolic structures out of straw, and he could quote by rote long passages from both Swedenborg and the Bible to justify millenarian claims. His proclamations were respected by many of the most important early followers of Swedenborg, as evidenced by how many of the original society went to visit him. And he was also visited, it is rumored, but I think this is probably true, by King George III at his Shoreditch workhouse. King George had lost, of course, the American colonies and was trying to get a grip on this. And it certainly seems likely, given best treatment, that he would have received. So, in a similar manner, Deakin was also quick to connect Swedenborg's concepts of the New Age with other currents of religious speculation going on during the period, and to use these to sort of promote a more spiritual understanding of the task of federation. The apocalyptic has always had a profound influence on people's political imaginings, and throughout history, movements have used millenarian and apocalyptic expectations to justify and ground their own political movements. However, Deakin's intellectual understanding of the federation concept allowed him to also engage in sort of mythologizing with other people within the Australian literary landscape, especially Bernard O'Dowd. Okay, there we are. He was a poet, a very well-known Australian poet, and Marcus Clarke. This is the other one, and we're going to talk about Clarke for a little bit. For writers like O'Dowd and Clarke, Australia was a mythic land of second chances and the crowning achievement of the English diaspora across the globe. To have democracy under the Southern Cross is a boon that will last 1,000 years. And O'Dowd went further and seeing the roots of Australian federation as being a new way of being in the world. And it was such a compelling idea that there are people who actually thought, this is what we're going to talk about Marcus Clarke, that this spiritual reality that was beginning in federation would have a physical expression in the world. And so this is Marcus Clarke, arguably one of the most important Australian writers of the 19th century. And he had a sort of bizarre thought about what this new freedom would mean in terms of human development. The conclusion of all this is, this meaning the development of the Australian people, therefore that in another 100 years, the average Australasian would be a tall, coarse, strong-jawed, greedy, pushing, talented man, excelling in swimming and horsemanship. His religion will be a form of Presbyterianism. His national policy a democracy tempered by the rate of exchange. His wife will be thin, narrow woman, very fond of dress and idleness, caring little for her children, but that was, oh gosh, I forgot this part. But without sufficient brain power, okay, moving right along. In 500 years, unless recruited to foreign nations, the breed will be wholly extinct. But in that 500 years, it would have changed the face of nature, swallowed up all our contemporary civilization. It is, however, perhaps unfortunately impossible that we shall live to see the stupendous climax. So this is also sort of funny. And he's being sort of funny here. I forgot the sort of humorous caricature, honestly, when I put this together. Should always read the quotes. You'll just place
It's really
up.
good.
But
Without the brain power to
so I told you not to read that one.
So good.
All right, moving right along. Don't you? Hey, I'm changing this recording. I do not accept this to be published here. So across the ditch, we have another Swedenborgian. This is Blanche I don't really know how to say it. Born.
Not me, born.
Born and Vaughan, change one letter. Okay, born. So Blanche Born, and Blanche Born was very important to the development of New Zealand identity, and she's very interested in what's going on in her sister country across the way. And she was also interested in how we could use Swedenborg's ideas in development of New Zealand. She had a little bit different idea. She wanted a very educated, and I think this is often how New Zealanders sort of depict themselves as, you know, they're in the Southern Cross with this very extenuation of English identity. And a lot of that had to do with her emphasis on education. And she was particularly interested in this man. His name was Samuel Wilderspin, and I did not include his dates. Oh, that's good. I also didn't include them over here. He dies, I think, in the 1860s. But he founded the Poor School in London. And his ideas was that you could form a society by increased education and by making education available freely. Educate mind, morality, and the body will follow. And she sort of was very much involved in trying to get that involved. So now it's time for the conclusion. What I wanted to try to do in this very short period is to make a case for the importance that Swedenborg's ideas had, particularly in framing the Federation movement. I think that there are many cases aside to the one that I've just laid out. But I think that at the very least, what I'm hoping to do is that perk your interest into seeing a little bit beyond what's seen as a rather boring thing, honestly, and to sort of reclaim some of this cultural context that this was going on. This was not a just random decision. This was literally a new way of trying to understand how you live in relation to empire. And how that sort of went about, were it not for Swedenborg's ideas about the sort of, you know, relationship between body, and there's a whole bunch of different expressions which are also found in Swedenborg that Deakin makes, I don't think it would have been as compelling. And he was willing. This would not have happened in England. I don't believe it would have happened in England. I don't believe that there would have been people who were sort of reaching out and including this sort of millenarian, spiritualist, vaguely mythologizing elements. This would not have occurred. But he understood that this was a new society and they needed these things, and he was very willing to sort of work with that, you know, and to write to these people and to engage them and to try to invoke their work. We know numerous times that he gave poetic readings in some of these writings. So he's very engaged in this. But, so finally, this is another quote from Deakin. And I often don't do so well with conclusions because that implies that you're finished with what you're thinking. And as you're getting to see, I'm a little rambly, and that's because there's so much that we are still considering. You know, I've read at this point the Gospel according to Swedenborg, but I specifically did not reference that here because I found so much to be in letters, in prayers, and these sorts of things. And that's because he really lays out a much more coherent claim in the Gospel according to Swedenborg. But to be honest, I thought to myself, most people are not super interested in political history anyway, and if I go in and I start reading rote by rote about the specificities of his plan, you're probably going to fall asleep, more so than you would even now. So it's my kindness that we did that. So I'd like to leave you with, really kind person.
Yeah.
I am realizing that nothing from you, Mr. Revealed and Explained, are two different things. It's the Dutch, you can't take them anywhere. Okay, so I leave with this quote, and I hope everyone can think about it and see that where does this take you, if it takes you anywhere. So Deakin writes about Australian Federation. It will be a union with strong foundations, set deep in justice, a union which will endure from age to age, a bulwark against aggression, and a perpetual security for the peace, freedom, and progress of the people of Australia, giving to them and to their children and to their children's children through all generations the priceless heritage of a happy, united land. And with that, I open for questions.
Yay. Well done. Thank you very much. That was great. Lots and lots and lots of thoughts.
I hope all good thoughts.
If I start, no one else will get a chance to speak, so I want to know if anyone else has got any.
I've got 5 questions, so I won't start either.
Maybe yours will cover all the other stuff.
One question is the Gospel according to Swedenborg amongst the papers in the National Library? Is that where we are to find it at the moment?
So,
Because it wasn't in the index when I looked.
so, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. We are going to make available the full written. We're going to do a PDF and make that available for anybody who wants to read it. We have to pay the library to produce that and to go from the originals. The microfiche is not really what we need, so that's what we're going to do. That's probably going to be available later, in a couple of months even. We're going to try to make that available so people can read it. The annotated copy, which is typing it all out and trying to do as best we can to follow through with where he was at the time, sort of show the personal engagements in his letters. That's going to be a little bit later. So it's in a secondary collection, and a lot of Deakin's work, to be honest, for a figure who was so monumental in the direction of Australia, his work is kind of it's difficultly it's strangely organized, and it's sort of haphazard really to find what you would need. So that was the point about wanting to put this work together. That way we would have an annotated book, and we can bring that into this cultural context about Australia, and really try to dive deep into what we were doing here. And I hope all of you realize there was a lot going on here. And there's a lot of people who think that there's nothing going on in Australia. And this is sort of a prejudice that a lot of people have about Oceania in general. Sort of like intellectual life dies when it somehow leaves Europe. And in fact, we find the exact opposite.
Because in 1788, the writings of Swedenborg came out to Australia with the first fleet.
I did not know that.
Well, it did. And not only that, in 1988, when we had the centenary reenactment, they brought in a chest similarly to the one that was brought out first, the collected writings of Emanuel Swedenborg.
I have that chest.
Do you?
So that's
How wonderful! I had no idea.
Oh, really?
No.
Did anyone online? Did you know about this? That they came and said, "Okay." See, this is what I mean. It's a very haphazard sort of thing, and I'm really sort of, it's sort of going out on a limb, just trying to convince a lot of Europeans, intellectuals who are used to staying in that very bubble, that there's a lot happening in the colonial world. I did not know. Thank you so much. I can't wait to take a photograph. Would you let me take a photograph of it? But you have to find it.
Should we let him into the fish club?
There's a fish club. I like fish.
I would have thought June.
No,
You know about that. June Johnson. Certainly know that.
June, if you're talking and we can't hear you.
You have to unmute.
Oops, there we are. That's better. Do you know, I hope that is, I've made a note of it, The Gospel According to Swedenborg by Alfred Deakin, but it's in a secondary collection.
Yes.
And so that would be really good to have. I have a question that I noted down amongst other titles. When you pointed out Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, was that lady that levitated?
I think she claimed to have done. Yeah, she claimed to have done a lot.
Yes, because some years ago, I saw an exhibition of I'm not sure what they called it, the museum here in Adelaide on North Terrace, but as well as Egyptian hieroglyphics and other things, they actually had Madame Blavatsky as a medium and spiritualist, and she was levitating because she was known to levitate, and they had a table with her levitated hanging from the ceiling. It was quite amazing.
Well, it would be really interesting to find that, because from what I know, and I don't study Blavatsky, but I did not know that I know that she made many claims to have levitated.
Yeah.
However, she specifically, so it may have been someone else associated with Theosophy, because she often didn't like she didn't want any of her own sort of miraculous doings to be filmed because she was very sensitive to the accusation that she was a con artist. And actually, at the end of her life, so she died, I don't remember where she dies, but she was living in India before, in Adyar, where the Theosophical Society is still headquartered. And there was an accusation that she was using sort of parlor tricks to increase the effectiveness of her seances. And she was it almost did her in. And she died very shortly thereafter. And when Besant took over, there was this idea of preserving all of Blavatsky's, in a sort of enshrining her. She was beyond criticism to a lot of people. But so if that picture was of Blavatsky, that would be very interesting. But she was interested in all, and I'm not saying it's not there. I mean, it very well may have. It's just not one that I don't know. But I know that it's theosophical. There's only a handful of photographs that they officially allowed reproduction of, because they wanted, and they're always a sort of same look where she's sort of, staring at you, and she had these mesmerizing eyes, these blue within blue pale eyes that she would just sort of look, and people felt like she was looking into your soul.
Photograph of her there.
Yeah.
Did you not?
Yeah. Look at you. Yeah. That's not a super, I mean, I was telling when we were here that I'll have to redo this so I can give higher quality slides. They look fine on my computer, but they apparently can't. Blavatsky, obviously, because she's the only lady. And this is Henry Steele Alcott. He would eventually leave the Theosophical Society and became a Theravada Buddhist. So you want to know another bizarre thing? So Buddhism goes to New York, and he later goes to Sri Lanka and joins up with Alcott, and he goes back to Sri Lanka, and he has this idea that he's going to bring Buddhism back to its scriptural roots, and they start this revival of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And there is an image of him in the capital of Colombo. He's all in gold, like you would any bhikkhu. So he's in gold, and there's also a great scholarly work about it called The White Buddhist. He started a Sri Lankan Buddhist revival. So the world is very strange.
Wow.
An American general goes to Sri Lanka to restart not restart in the sense that there's no one practicing, but to start a revival of a 1,000-year-old Buddhist tradition in a country that he could not speak the language and did not understand the movement. Many people cross-pollination, but thank you so much.
Did you know that the Augustus had a mansion in Mosman, which was known as the Manor, I think, and they educated Krishnamurti to become the new Messiah.
Yeah.
So they had this whole spiel. They built an amphitheatre in Balmoral, where he was going to come off a boat and be the new Messiah arriving in Australia.
Walking on water.
Wow.
Things were promised, and at the very last minute, Krishnamurti pulled the plug on it and said, "I'm not doing this. You need to think for yourself," and left the organisation. So another aspect. That was 1932 or 33, something like that. Might have been 35. I can't remember the exact date, but sometime around there. And there's another connection where, no, that's not my talk.
Yeah, so well, let's get back to the actual subject here instead of being on Blavatsky. Well, to me, what I'm interested in is you brought up early this idea that there are plenty of people who use Swedenborg ideas, but not in a theological way.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I heard from you today is that Deakin and perhaps others were using the idea of the grand man and kind of the structure of heaven.
Yeah.
Were kind of their main building blocks.
Often, yeah.
You know, so that's, I was kind of curious, was there any other doctrine type stuff that you're seeing that were, you know,
Yes.
what are the key principles that people are using to build government off of? Because as you know, Swedenborg writes New Jerusalem is heavenly doctrine, and from our church point of view, that's what we use as kind of our go-to to make church governance calls. So I'm kind of curious, where are people who are actually making governments pulling from?
So I mentioned, and this is also sort of the issue of selecting. There are people who have a lot of different ideas, and they're using Swedenborg in a variety of ways. Use, Homo Maximus, structures of heaven, these are the most common. But what we find in Deakin is he references correspondence quite significantly. He tends to see everything as correspondential. And he uses Swedenborg's understanding of the Bible. Sorry, I don't know what that was. I think I tried to sneeze or something. He uses the Bible as his articulation of the different layers of meaning to sort of approach what he's doing. And what he does is he sort of unites Swedenborg's ideas and connects them to this idea of like spiritual vocation and what is his point in this overall sphere. But it's much more than just those principles. I mean, just those concepts. Mm-hmm. But the difference is, unlike from the church perspective, for instance, Deakin was a Trinitarian. Deakin rejected Swedenborg's ideas about the Trinity. He rejected what he thought. If there was anything that he didn't like in Swedenborg, he just sort of didn't incorporate it. But what he ended up doing, and that's really why I think political Swedenborgianism was in some cases more successful than the church. Not more, that's wrong. I don't mean to say successful like it's like there's one that was better, but there were more influential. That's what I would have said, because it was, and Deakin actually has this. Deakin thinks that the church, Swedenborgians, I don't really know when he first hears of them. I think it's probably I'd say the early 1860s. He realizes there's a church as well. Early 1870s. But he often talks about it feels very rigid to him. Like he wouldn't go. He thought what Swedenborg was so powerful was that he was having experiences that all of these mediums were, but he was able to formulate them so beautifully into a philosophical concept. But he thought if he tried to put that into a church structure, it would become imprisoning. And
it's interesting because I'm thinking of the experiences of John Clues, who was in the COE, and very much thought that this movement would revitalize, take over the Church of England, and that was the way to do it. And yet the others were like, no, they're beyond hope. The only way to do it is to go off on our own. So what Deakin is saying is, this idea that if people just start to engage with this spiritually will transform humanity is like, that's not going to work. What we need to do is put this stuff into practice in a societal and governmental way. One thing that I find interesting, so you're saying that Deakin and others saw this as a wonderful model for social governance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Swedenborg never directly says this. But Deakin and others say, oh boy, this model of what life is in heaven. And I think also combined with, certainly the doctrine of use, but also the doctrine of charity, because you do look at so many examples where Swedenborg says, okay, so if you're a judge, this is what charity looks like.
Yeah.
If you're a binman, this is what charity looks like. If you're a police officer, this is what charity looks like. So it does make for a very nice model. But what I'm finding interesting is Swedenborg acknowledges different kinds of government, but he really just talks about monarchies.
Yeah.
Like that's the way government's run. Yeah, there's some other fringe government organization or models, but monarchy is the way. So it's interesting to see he can take this on and say, this is a great model for governance, but it's not Swedenborg's model for governance in a literal way.
You're correct. And what I really struggle with sort of including here is that Deakin has a particularly very interesting account about what it means to be faithful to what it means to be faithful to the monarchy. Because Deakin, on one hand, at no point are you going to find there were Federation supporters who did not believe, who wanted something like a republic. But it's very interesting about why it went the way it did. And Deakin was very much, he sort of was very convinced that, like Swedenborg, that monarchy was the way to go. And that's why when I mentioned it toward the end, I was trying to say, it's this new way of how do we live and the extensions of empire. That's the sort of question that he was interested in. What does this mean in terms of spirituality when we are talking about, we mean white, British descended Anglo-Saxons, or whatever. He was a supporter of the Anglo-Saxon society, but he also, supported some immigration from other places. But that was his question. And actually, that's one of his reasons for talking about restricting immigration, is because British immigrants understood the relation to monarchy, which he thought was fundamental in both Australia's past and had to be resituated in order for it to develop. And I think this was very successful. You have an Australian dollar. Who's on the dollar? Is it the dollar? You have if you have the Australian dollar and you see on it who's on the dollar. I mean, it's this sort of colonial relationship. And how that works out was a very long and complicated history. And what I think is actually interesting is the influence that Deakin here is having here. It's not just felt here. I think there are echoes of what he finds in Canadian, and the Canadian, and how Canadians sort of understood their own government. And there's a lot of these things, and I did want to say at the end also about the particular issue about race within Deakin. I am not saying at any point that he did not have controversial ideas about race, because he did. But what I tried to do and what I'm doing is to say that if you understood some of the motivations, you do not have to agree that these were good motivations. But if you understood it, it was more than just sort of a primitive, we can't be around people of different colors or different beliefs, because that wasn't what he believed.
Yeah, he had advanced ideas for his time.
In a lot of ways, and then he also had very centralizing ideas. And
God has advanced ideas for Deakin's time.
I just think that it's a real, and at this current particular political way, there's a lot about what Deakin said that's very easy to misconstrue his entire project, and it's easy to highlight, maybe one of his bad ideas about Aboriginals, etc. And I do think he had a lot of bad ideas. I think he had a lot of ideas that just sort of like, I can see what you're saying, but that's really sort of an odd way of looking at it. But
yeah, that's another one of my questions. I apologize for asking two questions or two observations. Danced or skimmed over.
This is like an attack pose. You sort of dance. Here I'm waiting for it. All right, where's the hook?
I'm not all Italian. I shouldn't say you danced. You skimmed this idea that as part of this federation, we also have to acknowledge the people, of different races, and the people who are here, but only to the extent we realize that they're just going to disappear.
Yeah, that's one of his bad ideas.
So okay, so I got you right.
Yeah, I just think, yeah, his motivation wasn't because he believed that there was, there's no jingoism, there's no word dominant in Deakin. The idea was, he literally thought that and to a certain sense, he buys into sort of this Darwinian idea, but he thought that because there had been so many losses in the Aboriginal community, he did not see that continue.
Okay, and I sort of got that from what you were saying.
But
it was the question.
But he does sort of have at these points, and this is the only thing that I would say about that. There is a point at which he sort of loses himself, and he talks about there are some cultures that are not going to be able to continue, and I think that's the worst thing that he sort of does, because he talks about society has to be open at a certain extent, And it's very much of his time. People were thinking in this terms. If you've ever read any Oswald Spengler, for instance, Oswald Spengler's in Germany, and he says societies are like organisms. They live, flourish, and die. And to a certain extent, Deakin takes this on in very not so great ways. But I think more so than that, he's really concerned with what does a future society look like, and how do we ensure that there's not going to become a permanent underclass. That was really his interest. He was a labor, he was a support. I mean, he supported a lot of things that we consider to be very progressive. Like he wanted protections of commerce. He did not want what he saw as market economy, because he felt like that would specifically, that would leave too much power in the hands of corporations and not enough on people sort of trying to make it. So he's very concerned with these sorts of things. And as I say, when he goes to India, he does not want there to be a permanent underclass. And because he is a man of his time, he just doesn't believe that cooperation is ever possible. He just cannot get his mind at that point. And remember, he is writing 20 years after the American Civil War, 20 to 30 years after the American Civil War.
20 years after the American Civil
1860 to 65, yeah.
War.
He's writing these things, and he's like, could that happen here? I mean, and there were several people who were asking this question. It's a particular colonial question, but I really tried not to, I didn't want to not address that, but I just wanted to say that it's not the same kind of racism, for instance, as people who, there were people who did not believe that Australian Aboriginals were fully human. There were people who had
No, I think there's a pretty fine, pretty clear line between acknowledging, well, Spartans aren't around any longer, right? Cultures come and go, and saying, oh, cultures come and go, so let's go this one. Right? Actively deciding that this culture isn't going to exist anymore.
And he definitely wanted to protect societies that he. But this is all a question of extent, and I didn't really want to make that the main purpose. But specifically toward his issues in federation, and I really think that once you start reading particularly if we're able to do a comparison with his notes from federation, Swedenborg becomes much more alive in those. And what my main goal is to get people to rethink about what Deakin's contributing to the federation argument in light of how he's seen Swedenborg. As I've said, I may make too much out of the fact that he's writing the Gospel of Swedenborg in 9 months, a 600-page document, in between parliamentary settings, and during his attending the first Balkan Federation conferences. I think that's really significant.
Yeah, I don't think you could deny that had an influence.
As Mr. Piggott, as Dr. Piggott may say, just give historians time. They will find a way to say, no, this is all coincidence. It's completely irrelevant.
Yeah,
if I could see here.
Such a question. One question would be: are you in some danger of, because of your admiration for Swedenborg, Deakin, of exaggerating or making distinctive thought which was relatively common? So, for example, the emphasis on use. Evangelical Christians, or the majority of Christians in the Protestant world, are obsessed by cult of usefulness. They talk about it all the time. So that would be the jargon at the time.
Welcome to my pilot, said the spider to the fly.
Good thoughts and bad thoughts about the Aborigines. You think it's a bad thought that he thought they were dying out, but I think the majority of people in Australia at that time thought they were dying out. A few white missionaries argued against it, but they were in the minority, I think.
I do think
so. There's probably extent to which his thought was not all that distinctive. I mean, when you come to the real issue of what you've been talking about, you talked about the millenarian context of federation. Do you mean by that there were people at the time who were having millenarian thoughts, and he was one of them, or there's a particular millenarian way of thinking about federation? How did he think about federation in a millenarian way? What does that mean?
So that I'll start with. I'll start with that question first. So there is an entire array of thought that we do not know how to make sense of historically. These sort of vaguely nationalistic, vaguely spiritual, vaguely ideas of, ideas of cultural progress and cultural ascension. These sort of come together throughout. You can see large periods at which these are occurring. And there's no real good way of talking about them. I'm saying millenarian, and I also say spiritual, and I use them badly, interchangeably. But they're not the same idea, of course. But what I mean is that in that particular context, to see a future event as having, profound change for this world and this experience, I'm saying that can be construed as a millenarian thought. And Deakin was engaging this in the sense that he was aware of this going on. He was communicating with people who were advocating for this sort of, what's going on here in Federation and this new way of thinking about empire. He was able to sort of harness that in positive ways and to both celebrate what they were seeing as this new mythology of Australia.
So what's the difference between millenarian and revolutionary?
Well, what is millenarian? I have no idea.
So millenarian, if you're talking about 17th century, it's this idea that there's going to be a literal 1,000 years of Christ on earth. There's going to be an apocalypse. There's going to be change, and it's going to have
a second expectation of the second coming.
Yeah, expectation of second coming. Like a kielistic, and it often tends to be much more radical than, say, millennialism, or this is, which is also a branch of church theology, where people are discussing the final days or eschatology, these sort of much more respectable ways. Millenarianism tends to be much more in the ground and engaged. And so I'm saying that there are these thoughts about that society will literally be changed inevitably from this moment on, and it is constitutive of a new spiritual dispensation or whatever.
So you're asking how's that different from revolution?
Yeah, how is it different from revolution? I would say that where you have, let's talk about some revolutions, where you have revolution, and by the way, I don't think there is, historically, I think that any revolution has its share of millenarian and apocalyptic expectation. Certainly was the French, was the English, definitely the English Revolution, Civil War was inherently millenarian. So I think it's there, but the difference is the impetus. So unlike in other countries where there's armed rebellion leading to revolution, here in Australia it was an ideological fight, and it was all ideological. There weren't people out in armed resistance against the British
Don't
government.
tell Peter Layla about that, though.
Well, some exception, but the vast majority, and the way that they're arguing is not in terms of armed resistance. It's that this is a new cultural shift. And I think that this is the context that I really want to highlight here. Because unlike anywhere else in the colonial, and this is a very unique phenomenon to particularly loyal colonialists, is that how do we define our experience? How do we mythologize our experience? All European monarchies have very elaborate mythological histories that are entwined in what they're doing. If you want a very clear example, look at the amount of Carl Gustavs there are in Sweden. There's all these Carl Gustavs, and these come from a completely, no offense, but a fictitious, or I should say a very symbolic history of Sweden that has a lot to do with Johannes Berias and the idea that the Swedes were the original descendants of the Goths, and that somehow Sweden was the origin. It was the place that all the tribes came from, and it was the ground of all existence. There are people who argue that it was the Garden of Eden. There are Dutch people who argue that the Brabant region was a Garden of Eden. Certainly British people who are saying this. So there's lots of these sorts of strange ideas going around, and those were very conceptualized here in Australia because it didn't have that mythological history. It was looking for something else, and Federation became that for a lot of people. It became not simply to define a relation with government, but it became the way to define a new people.
So can I ask a question in relation to what you just said? I'll ask rather. The Swedenborg presents this this reframing of the millennial outcome. That the second coming is no longer going to come. It is this revelation of the inner meaning of the Bible in plain English, plain Latin, whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's done, right? Move on with it. So is there any sign that Deakin understood it that way?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think that that's also where, and I'll go back to your question about use amongst evangelical circles very soon. That was the one that I was particularly happy to hear. I said gleefully.
So I have to leave now.
Oh, let me get my claws out. No, I think that definitely, you know, he did not believe in the literal revolution. He was not promoting it, but he thought that what they were undertaking was a new spiritual understanding. And he used those terms. Those terms were used all the time here in Australia. They weren't used all over. You certainly couldn't get away with that. And so you could get away with it. If you said, I'm going to talk about the spiritual destiny of the Australian person now, they would laugh at you. But in this time, that was a really salient issue. And he was trying to redefine this question of monarchy, this question of our relation to a shared past. For him, it was the British settlers here. And how do we understand this new movement going on? He relies on this intellectualization, and he reaches out to these sort of spiritual hinterground between respectability and sort of like dominant culture. Now, the question of use. So I think that you are making a fundamental, there is something fundamentally different in Swedenborg's concept of use. Because it's not by your works you shall know them. It's something much, much, much more radical. That your being, your offering to God is fundamentally what you do and how you relate to the world. And that there is no salvation, there's no ultimate salvation.
I would say how you contribute.
Yeah, how you contribute. How you contribute, how you engage with the world. You know, and this takes on an element in Swedenborgian theology that is much more extreme, I think, than any traditional Christian thought. I mean, and that's why I feel like it was so useful to us. Useful. Yeah. So why it was so utilized by these people who are trying to make these sort of spiritualist arguments about the purpose of state, etc., was because it shifted from just being about something, well, one has a soul and one believes, but no, Swedenborg sort of turns that around and says your entire destiny, everything you are, is based on your primary love and your primary usefulness. And literally, your eternal job, what you'll do from now on, is the core center about what you love to do most, what you live to serve most. And Deakin is completely in love with this language. It's how he sees himself. It's how he sees everything. And he doesn't believe it just simply in the way that you'll find that evangelicals who are saying, you know, we have to do this because God requires it. No. He sees it much more fundamentally. And he, at several points in the Gospel according to Swedenborg, says that if you create a state and a morality that is sort of united in this view of use, then you would create a kingdom of people whose souls are improving dramatically because of this presence of the state. So there is a point at which he talks about there's almost a redemption of the state that takes place in Deakin. And I do love him though. And I don't want to say that, they always say that it's always good to study an author with someone who loves him. And I love him and I admire this person who's able to do so much. And he's really funny. The most humbling thing I've ever read is that toward the end of Deakin life, Deakin talks and he goes, I haven't accomplished anything. I thought, what? You haven't accomplished anything? Created a new, you added to a new society, you rebuilt agriculture and you made things livable and you did all of these things that if you don't think that there's anything you've ever done in your life, I'm suddenly going to bow out very quick. But yeah, so there is a chance that I could be inflating some things. But I think that, again, and this is a really bad thing to do, because I'm writing with, a background in understanding, reading his gospel. So I have this background, and that's also impacting what I'm saying, but I'm not really addressing that currently. So not necessarily giving the whole thing. I think in the gospel it makes it much more clearer, but the difference is it's 600 pages, are very detailed and lots of Swedenborg quotations and these sorts of things. And it's not easy to condense that. I try to take the big points and say 600 pages, 2 volumes, single lines.
But the Gospel according to Swedenborg is Deakin's book about how he's constructing government based on Swedenborg principles.
So no, he would say he's outlining Swedenborg's theology. He did this with other people.
Okay.
But what he's doing in this time one of the largest questions is about morality, which to him is often equated with government. There's sort of this collapsing of this distinction. And good morality is thus good governance. And good governments must reinforce good morality. They should be sort of twins of one another. And he has this view, which I think is a very Swedenborgian view in a lot of ways. And then there's this constant search to reinforce. But he wrote other...
Justice is part of that too, because I got a phone call many years ago from someone who said, I've got some books here, a complete set of the Swedenborg books. Do you have any way that I could sort of sell them for a good money? I said, well, what's special about them? He said they belong to Charles Stuart Mine, who was the Supreme Court Judge of Queensland.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for a fact that he was the best friend of Samuel Walker Griffiths, who was the first High Court judge in Australia. And Charles Stuart Mine, Samuel Walker Griffiths and Deakin worked together very closely during the Federation effort.
That's a very important link, I would think.
Right? So,
Gold.
Just
struck gold.
it's another it's another link that somebody who actually joined the Swedenborg Church, Charles Stuart Mine joined the Swedenborg Church, was interested in finding something that could give him an anchor on how to face situations of justice, forge justice, look at a just society.
Let's puffy.
So anyway, so that's
we can look over to Mr. Piggott, and you were saying, Professor. No, but yeah, by the way, this is also the reason I love to do talks like these, because there's so much that's hiding out there that I didn't know Swedenborg's writings were here in 1788. You find all this stuff out, and it's just from talking to people, and you find so much of it. Thank you, because this is another avenue to pursue, and I really think, and I'm just thrilled, and thank you for all on the internet as well. Very much. I just feel like there is so much here.
So what Dr. Steer, Dr. Huggins, other questions you said?
Oh yeah, what were your other questions?
Yeah, 5 Stuart.
Don't ask mean ones. Just ask nice ones.
Clipping Angel's wing.
Clipping Angel's wing.
Was he into angelology in a big way?
No, I think that's a reference to. I think that he was thinking that I shouldn't say he. I think the author was thinking that like he was hitting angels on his way up. That would be what I don't know.
Well, it should be known that the conventional picture of angels, especially back in those days, but even still so now, is that angels had wings, they were special creation. Swedenborg says, no, every is a person who's lived here somewhere in the universe and has died, gone on, continue to be educated and be of use in that next world. And so they don't have wings, it's just a metaphor for their ability to get around. So if Deakin knew that, then clipping wings would be something he wouldn't have taken seriously.
No.
I don't know what he's
Well, and that wasn't Deakin. That was someone writing about Deakin.
Yeah.
So Deakin did talk a
Deakin would
little.
have seen it that way.
No, and that was just someone. I think they were just sort of making fun of it. But flight to fancy, and I think flight and angels' wings all probably goes together. But that's another really interesting point that. The ultimate end of Swedenborgian theology, we are souls, but angels are no different. Every human being, every angel in the heavens was formerly a human being. That's Swedenborg's ideas, and well, yeah. If you accept those views, then
It's not very biblical. Yeah.
well,
No, it's not, which is why Swedenborg was called out on heresy trials.
He was taken. He was put on trial for heresy, but was not convicted of heresy.
No.
Because they said there wasn't enough evidence, and it may have to do with the fact that Baron Swedenborg had a lot of friends like this. But yeah, it is. It's very, and that's why I think that these sorts of it's recycling, it's uncovering these theological nuances that are often lost to a lot of like what you call mainstream historians who just unaware of Swedenborg's ideas and are certainly not enough to engage them. I will say that one of Swedenborg's favourite things, and this is a Swedenborgian story that's often repeated, it's about a little girl and she asked, and this was a story that Deakin told his daughters and his sons, to my knowledge. And he was a very good father, by the way. He's a very big family man. He's loved by his children. But anyway, so there's a story about this little girl. She says, Baron Swedenborg, what does an angel look like? And he has a mirror, and he takes the mirror and he says, you, my dear, or something along these lines. And she, in that story, this big part of Deakin, he says at one point in one of the Gospels, he's like, we build a body of eternity, and our works are the reflection of eternity. And so he really saw what he was doing as a continuation of the work that he thought he'd do in heaven. And that is an incredible impetus. And I think that's why so many political thinkers were really taken by Swedenborg. And, and I don't really know, there's not really a think about left or right, monarchist, not. He's really somewhere very different to all of those. Because he sacralizes hierarchy, but he also believes that every single element has to work together. Hierarchy is not supreme because you're on top, it's because you have this great concern for every area of the body. And a lot of that, problematically or not, some people would call that paternalism, but
I note that, is there a hierarchy in heaven? Absolutely. Does anybody care? Not at all.
Doesn't seem to.
Right.
They don't seem
because everybody
to.
is manifesting their use and their purpose in the Lord's kingdom. So not the here we talk about politics. It's all about who's controlling who.
Once you've got a coherence of vision, you don't need a police force. You've got a voluntary agreement that there are some good things that are happening here, and we need to pull it up.
Yeah.
And by the way, that was also an idea that Deakin had about society. Because I'm fundamentally, I'm an anti-utopian of all forms. But Swedenborg, Deakin really believed that society would get to a point that was well established enough, but there wouldn't be a lot of these needs. But he believed in establishing a very coherent structure at the outset. But very much when you think about Swedenborg's heaven, it's sort of like there is a perfect order in heaven, and that gives a lot of freedom to the people who are there. And the angels are allowed to pursue their own lives and their own goals, because they know what the heaven is. He's literally the sun of the spiritual world, and you see him, you relate to him in these very direct ways. And Deakin really thought that in a very similar capacity to government, this new start. And it's very strange today. It's very strange to sort of try to understand, try to make sense of these very complicated, cultural shifts. We don't have a language really to talk about them. And that's what I'm trying to do. It's quite difficult. Because, as you say, I'm talking about a wide variety of things. But I hope...
You mustn't give up trying.
No!
It's too easy to dismiss Australia as being materialistic.
I will acknowledge that between religions can inflate Swedenborg's influence and everything, including aeronautical engineering.
Never happens.
That said,
well,
and there's no question that the Magna Carta affected everything that you just laid out in some respect. And Swedenborg knew nothing. Well, Swedenborg didn't affect the Magna Carta.
No,
right?
He wrote it.
You're right. In heaven, no time, no space.
A related question to this. You know how Swedenborg, sort of in his youth, was more interested in science than he was in theology, and sort of evolved into someone who became interested in spirituality.
I would reject that view, but yeah, I understand that.
Is the same true of Deakin?
No.
What was his interest in science?
So Deakin was very interested in practical sciences. He was very interested in scientific theory. He was very interested in agriculture and how things grew. I would not call him, he was sort of like a humanist. He wasn't necessarily so interested.
Does that include women?
What?
Because I don't hear anything about females at all.
And
they're half the population.
Not my field, unfortunately. I don't know. Yeah, he did think, he was someone who really embraced equality between the sexes. But I'm not someone who deals so much with women's. And to be honest, unfortunately, most people did not. During this period, there's sort of this assumption that when we talk about men, you're including women. but it's a problematic assumption, I understand. It's not something, but during the time, there were very few people, like Blanche Bourne, for instance. You do find this amongst female engagers of Swedenborg who are interested in particularly, there are women Swedenborgian, articulated as a political Swedenborgianism. And they tend to be very concerned about women's issues, as you would think they would be. But because I'm writing about Deakin, because I'm concerned with Deakin, you're sort of limited by what his concerns are. And really, and I would say this is unfortunate, it's another oversight, makes a lot of assumptions about how women are in relation to, the experience that he grew up with. He lived in a very standard heteronormative day where a lot of women, sort of followed the goal of their husband, and that wasn't. And he does say really strange things about women's concerns, for instance. But but you do bring up a point, and really, but I don't think the failure is so much within the scholarship that we can address. It's more so that he just doesn't really look at it that much.
Well, there is a woman who made a fair amount of difference in the Federation times, who also knew about Swedenborg, and that's
Let's get the pin ready.
Marion Marney, who was the wife of Walter Burley Griffin. And she was in the employ of Frank Lloyd Wright. She worked for Dwight Perkins, who worked for John Wellborn Root and Daniel Burnham, who were both Swedenborgian architects, the first inventors of the skyscraper. They worked in that practice together for a long period of time during the time of the Great White Exhibition in the Great White City, as it was called, the Great Columbian Expo of 1893. And during that time, Daniel Burnham wanted to set out this expo on the layout based on Swedenborg's descriptions of the heavens.
Yes,
that's what the design for that was. And then later on, Daniel Burnham repeated that planning in the same office, working with Dwight Perkins, which employed Marion Marney and Walter Griffin.
Yes.
And said, let's do a plan for Chicago, let's do a plan for Washington, D.C., let's do a plan for Manila, let's do a plan for all these cities, were all based on the same principles.
Yeah.
All based on Swedenborg. And so they carried that with them, and I think that Marion Marney is one of the most gifted drafts women I've ever seen in architecture. She could portray a visionary view of something that was just a box in the mind of, say, Frank Lloyd Wright, who she worked for.
Yeah.
And I think his success was largely due to her ability to portray the visions that he had in front of the customer and the people who paid the money. And then they won that competition for the Federation competition for putting together a plan for Canberra. Not that they carried it out the way that he wanted, but it was a big influence.
Yeah, when we were,
it still is in the plan of Canberra.
You could, and there's that great book about Canberra, and it's specifically about who's the Theosophist book?
Peter Proudfoot.
Yeah, Peter Proudfoot's book. The plan of Canberra, the secret plan of Canberra, which sort of talks about.
It's somewhere up here.
It really, we could sit here and we could start all these things, and the purpose of this is why these conversations are so wonderful, because it really shows far from nothing going on, and I know I've said that 3 times, but far from nothing going on, no. In fact, all of these sort of things that were on the outskirts and a lot of other, centers of power were much more effective here, so much more influential, and they had longer lasting political consequences. And so, I know, we have 2 Australians, 3 Australians, and a lot of people who have become Australians. But trying to recover this, it's a very strange thing. And I really would like for people to think about the same thing when you start talking about Australia, and you think about Celeste and all the sort of jokes about Australian masculinity and sort of drinking, barbaric, not really interested culture. No, in fact, it had a strong degree of that, and had, and it was implemented in ways that could have never happened.
Mateship is fundamental to Australian culture.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamental, and the core of it.
Yeah.
I've loved it, by the way. I can't say enough good things about Australia. This is my first time here. for any real length of time. So, and I had just,
Oh, sorry.
no worries. No, I said this is,
Look, Dell, you've made my day by coming here and giving this talk, and I would like to present you with a little gift as
oh,
well.
thank you.
I don't know if you have that book.
Swedenborg, Hermetic, I do not have it. So
But since you're studying at the Hermetic Amsterdam unit of the world,
the university has one
you may find that interesting.
I will, and so I hope all of you, and I want to extend the invitation online.
Thank
So
you.
at the Swedenborg Library in Chicago, we plan on doing a once monthly televised event, or not televised,
Oh,
recorded. We're going to sort of engage Swedenborgian culture, and this is sort of my bread and butter as a cultural historian, and I'm really trying to do this and to encourage these conversations and to encourage a great deal. And Swedenborg, you know, Chicago is the city of Burnham, so it was not lost on me that I plan on doing a sort of like a sister to this talk I've done today, talking about the American political architecture and Burnham's ideas of the city, which he actually wrote a plan. And again, there's a lot going on in the colonies. It's a fascinating legacy, and you have to understand it more. Thank you so very much.
thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Joining us online.
It's not very
Bye, June.
Bye, Joe.